John, Reggie, Joe, you guys ready?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Keisha, you ready to go? All righty. Folks, welcome. Welcome to our second installment in the series, March on Milwaukee, a digital history series. Today's conversation, race migration and the roots of resistance in the Cream City, helps to further contextualize the open housing marches by taking a second for us to go back and think about how we as a city got to the 1960s. I'm Robert Smith, associate professor over in the history department at Marquette University. I direct our Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach, and the gentleman who works with me on this kind of stuff, Adam Carr. Adam, can you introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, I do a bunch of different things around Milwaukee, and one of the honors of my life was to be involved in the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches, and as many questions as we were able to answer through that, I found myself with far more questions in the end, and that's why I'm glad we have this esteemed panel today to ask, I think, one of the core questions that I think the open housing marches poses to our city.
Sure. Man, welcome. You know, we've got three historians of Milwaukee, Wisconsin with us. And as Adam and I often say, history is fun. History is a good time. And we've got three folks who are going to give us quite a bit of their own knowledge and expertise, and then we're going to have a good time as well. Let me start by introducing Joe Walzer. Joe Walzer recently completed a dissertation, Making an Old World Milwaukee, that looks at the history and heritage of German communities here in the city. Joe, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Glad you're with us today. And then, of course, we've got Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson is a busy man these days. He's writing a lot. He's researching a lot. He's worked over at America's Black Holocaust Museum. He's now doing some journalism, and he also has a business, Nurturing Diversity. Reggie, we call on you a lot. Thank you for your time. How you doing today?
I'm great. Good to be part of this this esteemed group. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Absolutely. Welcome. And there's one gentleman, when we talk about Milwaukee history, his name is synonymous with that. We could go on and on about the various work and writings and historical research and commentary that John Gurda has provided us, none more important than the Making of Milwaukee, the seminal work. John Gurda, thank you for joining us today. And can you tell us really quickly, where are you again?
I'm in Upper Michigan, not too far from Mount Noggin, sheltering in place, and we're far enough away from people we don't wash our hands.
Well, we thank you for joining us today, and let us know if there's any technology issues on your end. Folks, we are going to do three things today, and the first of which is very much related to what we have been doing around some pedagogy and curricular stuff. We're going to chunk our conversation in three distinct sections. First of which, we're going to do a bit of a historical photograph exercise for about 15 minutes, in which we'll show some images from the open housing marches and some images that our panelists have shared with us. And we're going to use these images as a way to talk about some of the key historical developments that got us to the 1950s and 60s. We'll talk about some of the key immigrant and migrant groups and how they got here, how the city gets sorted along racial lines, and then also just making sure to take a moment to talk about how photos and photographs more broadly help us teach Milwaukee history and our city's cultural histories. The second thing we're going to do is give these researchers a chance to talk about their craft. So the next 15 minutes or so, we'll ask them to talk a little bit about how they go about the task and the art of researching and writing about Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We'll get a bit into their creative process, and then also wrap up with some conversations about teaching Milwaukee history. And then the last 15 minutes, we'll give folks plenty of time to ask some questions of our panelists and get us thinking about some of the key takeaways around Milwaukee history that we ought to be mindful of, and then also tips and ideas about delivering this history in the various media that are available. Particularly in this moment, it's important for us to think about all the avenues and opportunities that learning can continue to occur. All righty, folks, we're getting started with the first section. which will be this process by which we use photographs to explore and uncover history. Adam, why don't you take us into this process? This is your world. You're muted, big guy.
There we go. Give me 1 second here. So Rob and I, in presenting this, which we've done numerous times, we mentioned this last week, but it bears repeating. We learned how important it is to get this into a dynamic conversation that invites people into the space with us. How important media is. We actually found out in Vel Phillips Juvenile Detention Center. We put some of these images in front of the young men, and they started seeing things in these images that we hadn't seen yet, and introducing new parts of the story to us. So I just wanted to share this kind of opening salvo photos of the open housing marches for our panelists to take a look at and respond to a little bit. We're talking about kind of the period of time in Milwaukee that led up to the open housing marches. You can see here just that sign, open housing, and the big crowd that's congregated around that topic. It was this incredible flashpoint, open housing in the city of Milwaukee. These are some of the images that we've shown and that demonstrate just how dramatic, how full of conflict, how full of just sort of emotion that entire period of time was in Milwaukee. Here we see a confrontation between the youth council and police. Here are counter protesters here for a moment commingling, but then also standing here and sending a very loud and clear message to the youth council, to the commandos, to Vel Phillips and Father Grappi, what people thought of them on the South Side. I actually think in some ways it's important to look at this image without flinching, because it can be difficult to look at, knowing that in the same way that the marchers are still alive, so are the counter protesters. Some more dramatic images of just what it looked like and what it felt like. And I want to close with actually this image here, which is a little bit smaller, but just the general idea. And this is sort of the last piece I want to share before turning it to the panelists. The Youth Council in the years prior to, and actually in the year subsequent to the open housing marches, took on a number of different campaigns. So they'd worked on school desegregation, they'd protested the Eagles Club and employment discrimination, other campaigns. But it wasn't until they found open housing that they ignited the counter protests of the magnitude that they saw on the near south side of Milwaukee. As many as 13,000 angry white counter protesters came out to meet them. And I think in a lot of ways because in the mind of those counter protesters, it must have been because there was some transgression there, or it was literally a sense of trespassing on the part of these young Black marchers. So these images, I can scroll back through them, but I just wanted to share them for our panelists and for our audience, just to see. I actually think the color pictures always make them feel a little bit less in the past than the black and white ones, but just to see a little bit of, just how much was swirling around Milwaukee at this point in time, and talk a little bit about what was happening on the near south side of Milwaukee and on the north side of Milwaukee that sort of set the stage for this clash. And that is kind of my open prompt to you all. And now we can just talk.
For me, some of those images are nostalgic. I wasn't part of the open housing marches away at school for most of those, but was part of the marches with Father Grappi on Judge Cannon's home out in Wauwatosa. They're trying to lift the Eagles whites only membership policy. But after I graduated from college, I came down to the South Side and worked for 3 years at a place called Journey House on 16th in Washington, now Cesar Chavez in Washington. And a lot of those kids were the ones who'd been on the streets throwing bricks at the marchers as they came down. So it was really, there was a lot of sort of dissonance, kind of what was going on, because we loved those kids, got along with those kids, but they were doing some things that were pretty hateful, just two years earlier. and unapologetically. As time went on, the neighborhood became more and more Latino and African American as well, so that became kind of a moot point. But it was obviously it was a really volatile and in some ways anarchic time in Milwaukee's history.
I think it's thinking back to the image of the folks walking around with swastikas. I mean, that's really remarkable imagery to think about, particularly on the near South Side where there were so many Poles, that was happening, only 20, 25 years after the Second World War, right? And it was so clearly still fresh in the minds of folks in that neighborhood that folks presumably with Polish heritage to have adopted the swastika as a sign of racial belonging in the city is a truly remarkable thing to behold.
We'll never know, but my guess is that most of those people were not of Polish heritage.
Okay.
The people who were there on 16th Street when I was there were largely people from rural Wisconsin. They were people who kind of come in for factory jobs. So they could have been anything, Germans, Polish, Scandinavian, Irish, Yankee. But it was very much, it wasn't Appalachian, but it was sort of Milwaukee's version of Appalachian. It was people coming from the countryside to work in urban factories, and that was the real flashpoint there was Crazy Jim's auto lot.
Adam talks a lot about Crazy Jim's.
It was something. And that was a block north of Journey House. Jim Grove, he was a case, but he was kind of a magnet, for a lot of the racist opposition to those marches, and that was so there was it. I don't think it had any identifiable ethnic component. It was largely working class white, more generically, and rural especially.
Is it somewhat surprising then that by the 1960s that this broader category of white had begun to play a role in the city, so remarkably connected to distinct European cultural threads?
Actually, that's something too, Rob. That's a point that is on my mind a lot, which is Milwaukee is a city that was proud of its differentiated European identity of whiteness not being a monolith. And in some ways, yeah, I agree with you, Rob, that it's almost surprising to see kind of whiteness become this rallying. I mean, not surprising, but Milwaukee might be the last place you'd expect that to happen because there were such distinct cultural groups within a pan-European identity.
One thing I've said over the years was that if you have a strong sense of us, you're going to have a strong sense of them. Mm. And in Milwaukee, there really were some very strong ethnic cultures. And I think Joe has studied this. The fact that we had a non-English speaking language group that was dominant here, the Germans. They were a majority of the population. In some ways, that made Milwaukee safe for ethnicity of a European kind. The fact that you had in Boston, for instance, so the Yankee overlay is what drives things there. In Milwaukee, it was the Germans, so it was okay to speak Polish or Italian or Slovenian or whatever. But the thing that they could all agree on was that they were white. Mm-hmm. And when that became after World War II, especially between 50 and 70, when you have the Great Migration really kind of roaring into high gear in those post-war years, that's when it became something of a more linchpin of a cross-cultural identity. But in terms of some of the neighborhood dynamics, the North Side, one reason there was such entrenched resistance there was that you had these pretty intact German communities that lasted until well after World War II. So when you had African Americans moving just as the Germans had in that same northwesterly direction, you had oil and water. You had a real explosive kind of an encounter there.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead, Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add to that, and I think that to your point that I think one of the most remarkable things about ethnicity in the city is its continued prevalence, right? But that doesn't mean that it hasn't changed, sure. Right? And so whiteness, in Milwaukee as in elsewhere, to ascribe to whiteness and the visions and ideals of whiteness meant access to things like jobs and access to services, and it wasn't just agreeing on that. There were things that came along with shedding, maybe not shedding, but taking on this racial identity, and so I think that what we're seeing in a lot of those images, particularly how violently folks on the South Side were so willing to resist open housing, is kind of a protection of that quote unquote right that they felt like they had earned. And if we could maybe pull up a couple of those images, Adam, that I had added.
Get them up here.
20 years, 20 years ago, we had the Second World War, but also really violent strikes at Alice Chalmers that had pitted what we would think of white folks against white folks, right? Trying to gain access, trying to gain the rights and privileges and a better life in this community, and I think that the violent resistance to the open housing marches were, kind of in some way the logic, as flawed as it absolutely was kind of this vision of protection.
Mm-hmm. My dear friend Reggie Jackson, I never thought I'd ever have to say this to you, but I know there's a lot going on in your head right now. Do you want to share a little bit of your reflections on this topic?
Yeah. That's great information that they've shared, Joe and John. One of the interesting things about Milwaukee in the early 1900s, it was the most foreign-born city in the country, and we had a larger percentage of foreign-born residents. So, there was kind of a normalcy in having people from different parts of Europe and living in their own, kind of segregated neighborhoods. One of the interesting things I discovered about kind of where Black people lived in the city is the area where the Menominee Valley is now. That used to be residential area. It was rezoned by city leaders in the 1920s as a way to create a barrier to prevent Black people from moving further south in the city. And so as Blacks were forced into an area where they couldn't move either south or east or even west, they ended up, living in a community that was really a quite mixed neighborhood. We consider the neighborhood that people refer to as Bronzeville as a Black neighborhood, but it was a mixed neighborhood. About half of the residents there were actually white people. And because of racial restrictive covenants and, the federal government's redlining policies, which restricted where Black people could move, they were kind of stuck in that the oldest housing stock in the city. And as John said earlier, as Black people kind of moved, they moved in the same direction that Germans moved. They moved north and west. So as Germans vacated neighborhoods, Blacks kind of moved in those neighborhoods. And so when we look at what happened with the open housing protest against it, it was really not just about open housing. It was really much more so about the fact that white people were not all that excited that the Black population had grown so rapidly. In 1940, there were only 7,500 Blacks in the city, nearly 9,000 in 1950, 21,000 in 1950, and over 62,000 by 1960, and over 100,000 by 1970. So this rapid growth in the Black population meant that Black people had to live in different neighborhoods because it was too overcrowded where they were living before. And as they encroached on those different neighborhoods, white people weren't happy. So one of the things that I tell people about the open housing marches, I think is left out of the conversation too much, is the open housing wasn't just about moving to the south side. It was actually about moving to the north side as well, neighborhoods they couldn't live in. Black people used to refer to the area north of Capitol Drive as Blackfish Bay. It was a very exclusive area that only a certain number of Blacks could live in. And so one of the sad things I think about the open housing campaign, we celebrate the successes of it, But I was able to look at a special census that was done in 1975. And it showed that in those neighborhoods on the South Side, there were still barely any Black people. In most of those neighborhoods, Blacks were in single digits. So even though we celebrate the open housing marches as being successful in opening up the South Side, it really didn't open up the South Side. It opened up the North Side and the Northwest Side, but the South Side was still almost completely white. In fact, Blacks didn't begin to move to the South Side in significant numbers until whites vacated some of those neighborhoods. Latinos moved in, and Blacks began to move into Latino neighborhoods, but they never really moved into neighborhoods with white people in great numbers on the South Side.
No, I think there's a geographic sort of a really underlying reality about Milwaukee, and that's the valley. And it may have been zoned industrial, but that goes back to the 1860s. You know, and that's a half mile wide. And I think what happened in Milwaukee, the only other example I can see in the Americas, the Cuyahoga Valley in Cleveland, you know, sort of east side and west side of Cleveland, that's strong too. But Menominee Valley is hugely important. And I think the role it played in Milwaukee, and this goes way back to the beginning, there was this really kind of a centrifugal force moving on. So people on the north side moved north, people on the south side moved south. And kind of never the twain shall meet. It didn't matter who was there. You know, there was very little crossing from north side to south side or vice versa. And I think what happened is, as you have first the German, then Eastern European Jewish, then African American, you know, the foothold there is north side and the vector is always northwest. On the south side, Walker's Point was diverse. South of Mitchell south of Greenfield was largely Polish. And the displacement's just amazing. So what you have in through the early decades of the 20th century, south side Polish, north side German. You know, that was the stereotype, and it was just as segregated, you know, as it is racially today. And this process of displacement now, south side Latino, north side African American. You know, so the cultures are different, but the geographic patterns are pretty close, you know, to what they were back in those early years.
You know, we've got a question from our attendees. By the way, guys, we have 53 folks listening in right now. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for your time to come in and share this with us. We got a question about the northwest side of the city. Can you all share any thoughts about some of the neighborhoods that would be northwest side? I know we've alluded to some regions generally, but I think that question wants to get us into more that western and northern region of the city. Any thoughts you can share about that?
The big name there is Granville, you know, which is the old township name. It goes everything from 27th to the county line, 124th Street, from Hampton up to the county line at Mequon. It's a huge area, you know, 36 square miles. And that was annexed largely in one big by the Zeiler administration after World War II, after a lot of fighting with brown deer. They wanted it too. And what that did basically was, with some annexations in the south side, it doubled Milwaukee's land area. You know, so that was really important to tax base and important culturally as well. One impact it had in terms of Milwaukee's culture is, again, that's the vector. You know, African Americans moving north and west, so they settled in the old town of Granville, and that has become, you know, places like what some of the Golden Gate, you know, some of the areas up the northwest side, and that's become, you know, sort of middle income African American in a lot of those sections. So housing that's suburban and everything but address, but part of Milwaukee, and that's been pretty much, you know, very much part of the settlement by African Americans as they continue to move. So it's an important part of Milwaukee.
Well, you know, that region does look and feel what would be traditionally Midwestern suburbia.
Absolutely.
And the layout of the homes, the streets, the sidewalks are not, you know, there are a number of indicators of what would be Midwestern suburbia in that region.
One point of information, do you guys know
about that?
Oh, go ahead.
That part of the city, as John said, you know, that was kind of an escape from the central city for African Americans who had, you know, decent incomes. But what began to happen, though, in the 1990s, when I moved back to Milwaukee, I began to see, I didn't even know I was away from Milwaukee for about 10 years when I was in the military. When I came back, I didn't even know that Black people lived out in that part of the city. But as I came back, I was invited to parties at, you know, people's homes and stuff out there. I began to notice that there are Black people out in that part of the city. And I had never explored that part when I was a kid. But one of the things that I started to notice in the early years I came back to Milwaukee, early 90s, is that there were more poor Black people moving out to that area. Particularly into the apartments that were out there. You know, that part of Milwaukee has the highest concentration of apartment buildings. And so you started to see poor Black people move out there. A lot of people with Section 8 housing vouchers moved out in that area. And so you began to kind of see that area transition and look a little bit different than it had looked before. It wasn't as exclusive as it had been before.
Yeah. North Meadows, you know, is the big one out there, 91st Street. You know, that was a very, very far removed from the sort of subsidized housing in the heart of town.
Right.
But
One point of information, the old Granville rail station on 107th and Brown Deer. Does anybody know what's in that building now? A Jamaican restaurant. It's Irie Palace. And I just looked it up. They're doing carry out and pickup. So yeah, I mean, speak of kind of progressions. Also, too, just one other thing about the northwest side of town. People are very enamored with the idea of Milwaukee being a small place. And I think it can be in some really beautiful ways. Like, I went to high school with John's son and stuff like that. But don't tell me Milwaukee's small until you know Granville. Because that is a huge swath of the city that the people who love Milwaukee as a small place would have a lot to learn. So, actually, speaking of which, I'm wearing a Rufus King hat right now.
Oh, very good, very good, Adam.
I'm very provincial.
You know, Command Central is telling us that we need to start to move to the second segment. Before we do, I want to give you folks any key thoughts, ideas about the immigrant migration experiences that you'd like to sort of wrap this section up with. Any thoughts you want to share with folks?
Let's do that in the next 3 hours.
Take your time, John. Take your time. Any thoughts at all, though, before we move?
If there's one takeaway, it's that Milwaukee's always been a city of newcomers, you know, from the very beginning. It goes back to the early Yankees and, you know, them being uncomfortable with the Germans who kind of came in, and then the Poles coming and making the Germans uncomfortable. You know, we've always been a city of diversity, which I think is one of our most important strengths and has also been one of our most difficult sticking points.
Yeah, I think another thing, people don't realize Milwaukee kind of started as a very segregated, you know, space, you know, Kilbourne Town, Juneau Town,
right.
Walker's Point. So it started as a very segregated place. And, you know, we couldn't even build bridges across the rivers in town without causing people to fight over bridges and tear bridges down. So there's always been this consternation between the different groups in Milwaukee. And, you know, people are surprised at it, but, you know, that's part of how Milwaukee started.
Yeah, then it wasn't so much ethnic. It was, I want money on my side. You know,
Right.
screw your side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that also gets to the point of Milwaukee as being contested space, right? Starting from the beginning with white settler colonialism, and, you know, how did Milwaukee begin? Well, it began by evicting Native people from this land, and so that as being a key formation that then ends up continuing. You know, different groups coming in for jobs, for work, you know, those contests between labor and capital, and different groups coming in, old immigrants, new immigrants. These are very painful struggles that lie at the heart of what we think of as being a history of progress, right? The city from beginning to end, this line of growth, and how we imagine that is really important to, you know, how we think of the future, for sure.
I will give that man a PhD.
Ain't that America?
Great. Let's move to the second section of our discussion today. And Keisha, if you can put the slide up for us. For the next 15 minutes or so, we want to talk about you all's process as researchers and scholars, and give our folks who are joining us a chance to talk through some of this with us. We have a number of educators who have joined us, might have some students out there too. Let's talk about the researcher's process. When you go into your archives, or if you're you're looking for information in secondary literature, what are some of the key themes that you all explore? What are some of the key ideas that you're curious about? What are some of the challenges you faced? Talk to us a little bit about how you work. What is your work process? What is your both your interrogation and your creative process? And then we'll get into some thoughts about teaching Milwaukee history as well. But let's have a researcher's conversation for a few minutes. Tell us how you go about your craft. Reggie, you want to start for us?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, most of what I've looked at is the African-American experience in Milwaukee, going back to the very early days, and look at the transition of different groups of Blacks who came here from, different parts of the country, and how that's impacted the Black experience. One of the key things that I've done research on over the last couple of years and working on a book about is kind of the history of segregation in Milwaukee. And not only, how segregation played out, the practices and policies of it, but the impact of those practices and policies, even on how we look today, what our communities look like today. And a big part of it is really exploring some of the things that other people have written. I've used a lot of John's research. I tell people all the time that I've learned more about white people by studying the history of people of color than I've ever learned in my life, because people are always in those spaces together. We tend to kind of segregate things. We talk about African American history, Native American history, whatever, but it's really, you can't separate those because people were in those spaces together. And really a lot of what I've learned is about the practices and policies that impacted Blacks in terms of segregation. You have to explore where those came from and why white people wanted those practices and policies in place. And that really has helped me to understand why Milwaukee became, this very kind of segregated region when it came to African Americans coming here in larger numbers in the 50s and 60s, for those manufacturing jobs. And then just as importantly is what's happened to Milwaukee, especially the central city, since those manufacturing jobs started to dwindle away. What was left, thinking about the 30th Street corridor and all those old factories that are still there, that are vacant buildings, and what the neighborhoods still look like now.
Reggie, I often say in class, it's very complex in some ways, that because of Jim Crow, Black Southerners in particular and white Southerners were actually in very close proximity. The history of Jim Crow, the way we think about segregation would suggest otherwise. But in fact, it's because of Jim Crow in a lot of ways that the social proximity is far closer and far more consistent in terms of contact than we realize. Joe, John, either of you guys want to jump in, talk a little bit about your thoughts and your curiosities?
How do you work, Joe?
Oh boy. Well, I tend to dive right in, and I think that, to Reggie's point, that he's learned so much about white Milwaukee by studying Black Milwaukee and the experience of Black Milwaukeeans. I think that kind of was a similar experience, but flipped for me. I remember early on in the process, explaining my idea to Rob, and he said, boy, it really sounds like you want to write about Black Milwaukee, but I did it kind of by describing Germanness. And so I kind of dove deep into, I'm really interested in how ethnic groups, particularly the Germans, because, as John, you said, that's, so much of the city has been shaped by German Milwaukeeans, and thinking about how over time they've talked about that identity. And so it was a lot of just sitting down and reading, and things that, and kind of rediscovering things that are familiar, but then reading it with a new light, and kind of thinking about, all right, how does this inform what it means to be a German Milwaukeean, and what then on the other end of that does that tell us about how they engaged with space and place and understood racial and ethnic belonging in the city. And so, and to that end, I think it's really important. So, historians are really concerned with the archives, right, as we should be, you know, and the archives are our church, you know, kind of. But I think the city is, you know, the city itself, it's important to think of the city itself as its own archive, right? And so I really enjoy just getting out, walking around, driving around, and thinking about this space and the people in it, how we interact with one another as a historical product itself that we need to understand as well.
If more people thought like you, I think I'd want to be a historian.
In terms of my process, I think in terms of storyline, I think of where we are in 2020 is the most recent chapter, and go back and seeing how we got to this chapter from the last chapter. So you look at deindustrialization, that we're still in the throes of, and where did that come from? It came from industrialization. You know, so that, and what did that do? That brought a whole lot of people up here. And why was that? Because there were resources, because there was innovation and entrepreneurship. So you kind of see this procession of forces and moments that ended us here, you know, May 13th, 2020. But go back in Milwaukee's case, Native American times. So trying to trace that story and all the questions that at every single one of those pivotal points is raised, you know, by seeing where we shifted. You know, the questions become obvious, you know, the more you think in terms of story. In terms of finding out what the stories are, talking to people, there is no substitute for that. I've interviewed thousands of people in Milwaukee over the years. But you also have to have the historical record, and my second home is the humanities room at the Central Library. You know, I spent so much time there. My mother would call me there on occasion, you know, because she knew I'd be around. Sometimes, or the librarians, you know, kind of, they had a question they thought I could answer it, I'd be handed the phone. So I've been sort of, for many years, you know, kind of absolutely dependent on librarians and archivists. I'd be selling insurance if it weren't for librarians and archivists. The other one is the County Historical Society, you know, which also has a first-class collection. And for a lot of things, including newspapers, Wisconsin Historical in Madison, that's a wonderful resource. We are well served. We are well served in this community, you know, by the resources we have to try to do that storytelling. So it's kind of, in terms of the writing process, that's like a little bit different from the sort of one step beyond the research process. But I tend to think in terms of puzzles, almost spatially. I look for the edges. Kind of, what are the edges? You know, what am I not going to go beyond? So you need to do that, you know, to kind of sort of define your territory when you're doing any kind of writing project. And once you have the edges, then you work very painstakingly, kind of putting those puzzle pieces in the middle. Hopefully you come up with something that has some coherence.
Reggie, you have a good puzzle metaphor too. I've heard you use it a few times.
Yeah, you know, I've spoken about you know, this idea of kind of how we explore history is kind of like giving someone a 1,000-piece puzzle. And you can give it to them in one of two ways. You can give it to them, you can give them the box with the cover on it, or you can give it to them with the cover off of the box. So they have the 1,000 pieces, but they don't know what it's supposed to look like when they put the puzzle together. And that's really what historians do, is they paint the picture. So they give you the cover. You know, and then that's, like John said, it's a very painstaking process of figuring out how to create that storyline and the narratives and telling those personal stories to help people understand, like John said, how we got to where we are. But really, you know, I've always liked the idea of thinking of it as this giant puzzle where we get it and we don't have the cover, and we have to figure out how to make that cover as a story. That's what we do.
I've extended that metaphor a little bit. I feel like sometimes Milwaukee is a trash bag full of puzzle pieces, and you're not sure if it's like 3 puzzles or 10 puzzles, or like you don't even know. No one tells you there's 1,000 pieces. It's just a bunch of it's just a bunch.
Right.
You got to start putting. You got to find edges in the corners for sure.
You know, folks, for our attendees, we're going to move to Q&A in just a few minutes. I do have a question here that I want to throw out to you really quick that came from our attendees, and it's about radical geographers. One of the things that I learned that's been very beneficial is to borrow and learn from other disciplines. And think through how, as a historian, other disciplines help to complicate narratives and provide some complexity to ideas. One of those arenas, one of those disciplines that has been very sort of a fringe value has been geographers. I did not know how to think spatially. I didn't quite understand it. And then once I began to work with colleagues who are geographers, I learned a deeper appreciation for the importance of thinking about space and race and all of that. Have you all bumped into any work from radical geographers? Have geographers played a role with some of the ways you think about race and community and neighborhoods and spatiality and all those words?
My terminal degree is a master's in geography. You know, I had no academic standing in history. And what I was doing at WM was kind of historical geography, which is the intersection of time and space. You know, and that's where I live. That's pretty much where I live. And it drives me nuts when I read any history and I get a sense of a place. You know, everything happened someplace. Everything did. It had to. But often that's kind of the whole dimension that is ignored and neglected in historical discourse. So that's something. Yes, I benefited greatly by geography.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. There's an old map of Milwaukee from the 1920s that's at the library, the Golda Meir Library at UWM. And it's a map of the neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and it's color coded by ethnic group.
Yeah.
And
Associated Charities. Yeah,
it's a fascinating way to see, you know, that period of time in Milwaukee, how segregated, you know, different ethnic groups were. And, you know, you really never think about it because we just assume, you know, all these white people living together in harmony, but you see that they created very, you know, spaces that were comfortable for their particular group of people.
That's a cool map. It's one section that just like 6 square blocks is Austrian.
Yep. Yeah.
It's really, really
for sure.
You know, panelists, as you all talk about the various archives and institutions, you got a thank you from Tanya over at the public library. Wanted to give you a shout out, John. I know we've got Kristen over with the Wisconsin Historical Society. We might have somebody else from the Milwaukee County Historical Society in the mix as well. So I appreciate you all highlighting the very rich troves and collections and all of that our institutions have provided us around this question. One more question and then we'll move into Q&A. Talk a little bit about how you teach Milwaukee history. Some of your approaches, some of your ideas. You know, if you're standing in front of a room, if you're standing in front of a classroom or you're giving a public lecture, talk about how you teach Milwaukee history, anything that jumps right out to you.
You want to start, Reggie?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I found is that young people particularly prefer to not study history in the way that older people do. They look at it differently. They're disconnected from it. So one of the tools that I use is really to look at the role that young people have played in the history of Milwaukee. So when we talk about the open housing marches, we talk about, you know, the campaign to desegregate the schools. You know, I engaged the young people in conversations about what those young people were doing at that period of time, and then have them explore what they think they would have been doing if they would have been a young person in high school at that age. So really to kind of bring them into a space where they can kind of see their peers instead of just, you know, hearing the same old stories about Father Grappi and Vale Phillips. You know, talk to them about some of the younger people that were there. And that is a much more engaging way of looking at history from the perspective of young people when they can see themselves in the stories.
And we're the predominant authors of the open housing marches. I think that's been something that sort of haunted us as we've tried to share the story. You know, we say to young people, this is your story, but if they have heard of it, it's been centered on adults, you know, so it, you know, they give very, I think, very well justified side eye.
What about you, Joe?
Yeah, well, just maybe to second Reggie's point exactly, I think that, you know, it's important, particularly for young people, to see their place in the city's history, right? I mean, you live here, right? And you have a place here. It's really important to emphasize that. Even if you're the newest newcomer, you know, you're still part of this history. So I really try to highlight that, and I really try to produce in my classroom a venue not only where people can see themselves in the city's history, but also engage with it, you know, one-on-one, right? And I think we would be remiss if we didn't also include in our list the folks over at the Golda Meir Library and the archivists at UWM and the American Geographical Society Library. And
I love the shout outs. Keep them coming.
Yeah.
That's great. I love
right.
it.
Well, and being at UWM, we have the benefit of just being able to go across the street and engage with these materials one-on-one, and being able to be hands-on historians in the classroom. And I think that that's really important because then, you know, this is definitely a profession and a practice that we all need to exercise, right? Thinking critically about ourselves in time and space and in relationship with one another.
Yeah, I want to just add, you know, Joe and John have both shared, you know, their fondness for these archives. You know, my wife used to tease me that I was spending too much time at the Golda Meir Library. She was wondering if I was meeting some woman there or something. But, you know, these are places that we enjoy being in those spaces because it has stuff that we enjoy, that we're looking for. And it's a place where you can engage in the work in a way that you can't in any other space. There's so many resources at all of these places that have been mentioned that people in Milwaukee just don't know, the treasure trove of valuable information about the history of the city. And I don't think that the average person would ever enjoy those spaces as much as we do. But, you know, they're my favorite places to go in the city.
Getting lost in time. So I think of that.
Absolutely. What'd you say, Reggie?
My approach to teaching, no, I don't do formal teaching, no, as you do, Joe or Rob. Reggie, you know, you have regular classes or not?
No. I used to be a teacher in MPS for 8 years, though.
Okay. Most of my stuff is one-offs. I think of myself as a writer more than a teacher, but I talk a lot to adult groups, mostly, but also to kids. And what I really take pains to do is to tie past and present together. You know, to make sure that, you know, the story I'm telling, the points I'm making, have some relevance to who we are today and where we are today. You know, having the sort of antiquarian approach, you know, I'm fine if people want to study the British monarchy, but it's not a sort of clear and present relevance to me. What's important to me is kind of who we are now and where we are now. So I sort of take pains to underline those connections. Also, you know, we did the Making of Milwaukee documentary series, and from the very get-go, we raised money to put together a curriculum component to that entire series. So you can go to Making of Milwaukee, you can Google that and go to it's a tab called In the Classroom, and we have hundreds of pages of both resources and lesson plans, almost packaged activities for all grade levels to study Milwaukee history. And that's been, we've done some in services. Now they call them PDs, professional developments. It used to be called in services. We've done a number of those for MPS teachers and others. But I think that it's really important to share the past with our future. And that's been a lot of what that whole curriculum effort is about. It's been well received.
You know, as we move to Q&A, we do have several questions from the attendees. And one question that came up a couple of times was this very point. Any recommended books, research regarding Milwaukee history? Let's make this a round robin kind of a free-flowing thing. Just throw some titles out there. Don't give it too much thought. We've got Making of Milwaukee. We dropped that in the chat for folks, but just give us a couple of other suggested readings, whatever they might be regarding Milwaukee.
Immigrant Milwaukee, 1836 to 1860 by Kathleen Conzen is a really good book on Milwaukee's early ethnic history.
Keep it
Yeah,
going.
one of my favorites is Joe Trotter's book, Black
Yeah.
Milwaukee: The Making of a Proletariat. You
Right.
know, looking at the history of blacks in Milwaukee from 1915 to 1945 is a really valuable resource to kind of learn the early history of blacks all the way up to World War II.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great works that have come out recently too. Two of my more recent favorites are Eric Fury Slocum's Contesting the Post-War City, I think it's called, and then Tula Connell's A Conservative Counter-Revolution. Both kind of tackling, they're kind of bookends to the same era, tackling this this post-war period, you know, of urban development that was really pivotal in really kind of making the city the way it is, and the racial landscape as well.
Yeah, those are both new. Those are both pretty recent titles. Yeah.
There's a anthology that was published last year. It's a collection of short essays named the Milwaukee Anthology that I really appreciated reading. I think, if anything, Pardeep Kaleka's essay in it is worth the price of admission, but it's a very interesting, it's very sundry. It's all over the place, but I found that to be really interesting.
And that had a lot of voices you don't usually hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good piece. Yeah, and speaking again of geography, I did a book for Historic Milwaukee Inc. a few years ago called Milwaukee City and Neighborhoods. So that has a lot of good information, I think, about grassroots Milwaukee.
John, when I'm doing a Zoom call and I need my computer to be a little higher, I use that to help prop my computer up. As not as like a metaphor.
Or hold your door open.
No, I use it all the time.
What's Jim Nelson's book, Educating Milwaukee?
Yeah. Yep.
That's a good one.
You know, I will say, I mean, this isn't a book, but I mean, this has already been mentioned, but Reggie's columns in the Milwaukee Independent. I work behind the scenes at Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, and I'm always jealous that Lee got you in such a good relationship, Reggie. But the stuff you write on a consistent basis, your archive is really incredible. What you're writing, because you're writing about history, but you're also wrestling with the present too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, here's
one of my favorite kind of ways of exploring Milwaukee. You know, I moved to Milwaukee from Mississippi when I was 7 years old in 1973. And just kind of thinking of the area that I lived in, we lived right off of 14th, just north of Burleigh, you know, right in the heart of the 506 zip code. And kind of seeing what that neighborhood looks like now versus when I was a kid. I wanted to explore that with people. And so I did a series of pieces about growing up in 53206 and talked about my lived experience there and then what happened to 53206, kind of contextualizing to people. Because, you know, people hear about 53206 now and how horrible it is and all of these negative things, but people don't know that it hasn't always been that way. And it wasn't, you know, a bad place to live. It was a great place to live. As a child, I loved it. I wouldn't give up my childhood for anyone's. And so, you know, part of what we, you know, one of the points John made earlier about, you know, contextualizing then versus now, like how did these transitions take place? And I think in many respects, people don't really understand those things, especially if they didn't live in particular parts of Milwaukee. I think, you know, another thing that I think Joe and John have done a great job of is talking to people who've lived in these different neighborhoods, and you know, especially what I call the old heads, right? Mm-hmm. The older residents that can tell you, you know, 30, 40, 50 years of history of the transitions in the neighborhoods. I think those are really valuable to kind of see how changes take place over time, because people just look at a place at a moment in time without understanding how it got to that particular condition.
I think that's a deep, important point of the open housing marches that might not be apparent given the context most Milwaukeeans come into it with, is that they weren't trying to get out of Milwaukee. They were out of Black neighborhoods. They were trying to build equity within them. And I think that actually is something that folks might, like we already discussed it here a little bit, is that it's not that the South Side was better. It's just a lot of times folks were trapped in this cage of not having the avenues of home ownership open to them and the ability to build generational wealth.
We're dropping the titles into the chat, folks. If you have other recommended readings, please drop those in the chat for all the panelists and the attendees to see. This is a great question for you, folks on the panel. When did you know that you were a historian? I love that question. Thanks, Barbara. That's a great question. Was there a moment? Was that what was the moment that
we're right at 1 p.m. So can you guys go like
we're gonna wrap up in about 5 minutes. So
10 minutes? You guys got another 10, 15 minutes?
7. We'll get them out of here quicker. But when did you know you wanted to be a historian? When did you know that you were a historian?
Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm imagining you guys grooming your mustache, looking in the mirror when you're 18
with a pipe.
Joe got a doctorate, so that's a rite of passage.
Yeah, so I found myself becoming a historian, learning that I became a historian as an art student at UWM, of all things. So I actually started out, I wanted to be an art student, and then found myself taking more history classes. And then what really excited me was the ability in those classes, through those classes, and through my own explorations of learning more about the place that I lived, and particularly my family history. And I think family is a real important avenue for people to engage with history. As my dissertation also talks about, it can also be a dangerous thing to think about as far as heritage and how that intersects with race and understandings of racial belonging. But it's also very engaging, and that's kind of how I came to it. So here I am.
I guess I knew I was a historian when I realized it was the only thing I was doing. Period. And I had gotten published, and people were reading things that I'd written and said, "Oh, you're the historian." So it was, it was not something that I woke up one morning and put a sign on my door, but it became, I sort of grew into it somewhat organically. How about you, Reggie?
Yeah, kind of for me, my exploration of history started when I was in the Navy, right after I got out of high school. A lot of long days and nights out to sea. I'm telling you, it's pretty boring. So I really, would buy a lot of books before we left port, and started to explore history in a variety of ways. And then when I started college in California, I was going to school to be a social studies teacher. So I wanted to be a history teacher. And but really, for me, I would say that as I learned all these things, the first place I could say where people started kind of considering me a historian was when I started becoming involved with America's Black Holocaust Museum as a griot there. That's kind of how people know me. A lot of people know me from that experience, and it's kind of just grown from there.
Yeah. One more question that came across. I just wanted to give you a chance to respond directly to this. You've talked about it generally. There's a question from Luis. What's the best approach to get a hold of historical images and footage when researching? It's one thing to go to the archives. It's another thing to know how to request it. Best approaches to requesting images and video footage. I think that's worthy of a short conversation. You guys got any tips on that?
Wisconsin Historical Society has a great digital collection. You can look at a whole lot of stuff online at Wisconsin Historical. County does as well. Milwaukee Public Library, not so much, but it has a good finding aid, so you'll know what they have and what they don't, at least in terms of the pews in the church. But all three of those places have wonderful iconographic collections.
Really, I would say take advantage of the professionals that are at those organizations. They can show you how to access those materials, how to use them properly and things of that nature. You don't have to do a lot of the work. These are people that have done the work for you, and they can point you in the right direction. And really, that's what they love to do. So they'd love to have you request these records and help you look them up and things of that nature. So take advantage of the people that are at these historical societies and libraries. That's what they do for a living.
And importantly, UWM is an area research center for the State Historical Society. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to go to Madison to use this stuff. There's a lot of good collections at Golda Meir at the ARC, and you can request things from Madison, have them brought in as well. So it's
one of the worst mistakes I made early on was not speaking to a librarian or an archivist at the beginning of the project. And so I don't even I don't even think about touching anything in a library and archive or an archive unless I get the opportunity to talk to a librarian or an archivist about what I'm doing to help me think through the source options that are available before I even get into an archive.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Yeah, and they know what they have,
Absolutely.
you know,
And
and
typically know exactly where it is.
exactly, and they know exactly where it is. And as Reggie said, it's, you know, like it's their job, you know, and they're very good at what they do. So, and also a lot of area research centers, UWM, the State Historical Society, have done a great job of digitizing images. Not everything, so you'd still have to probably talk to an archivist and go through and see other things if you have something more specific in mind. But if you're just looking to check out some great image resources, both of those institutions are great for that.
So I maybe
There
made
are a lot of other facilities around the country, the National Archives. One of the places I found some really great images as I was doing some work on the history of the Ku Klux Klan is Ball State University had just hundreds and hundreds of images of the history of the Ku Klux Klan from around the country. So there are a lot of places outside of here. And one of the interesting things about the Wisconsin Historical Society is that they have one of the largest collections of information on the history of Blacks in the South in the country. You would wonder, like, why does the Wisconsin Historical Society have all of this stuff from the South? But they were able to take advantage of a relationship that they built many years ago and provided a space for many of those documents, which, some were destroyed in a big fire down in Tennessee, and they took it upon themselves to offer space to protect some of those documents. So they have a treasure trove of information from Southern history of Blacks right here in Wisconsin. You would never expect to find it here.
Another national resource that certainly is addictive is Library of Congress's Images of America.
Yeah.
And it's bottomless. It's just wonderful to poke around in.
Can I have one overtime question to ask you guys that would probably be better suited for a 3-hour response, but this is kind of one that sits heavy on my consciousness a lot, which is, we're living in a moment where people want condemnation more than critique, or even critique can feel like condemnation, where like the protagonists of one story are the antagonist of another. Particularly as we talk about where we started, the sort of prehistory of the open housing marches and the European community and the Black community. And I mean, I even saw in the chat, like, ideas of colonialism, or they even mentioned in our conversation, how we can both, I mean, I live in a 100-year-old house, so I know was built by a European immigrant, and, and how can we hold both critiques of racism, institutional racism, how deep that is within the DNA of our history, while at the same time living in and amongst the present and not kind of saying we're going to dunk on old white racist guys and them all away, understanding that they were more than that.
It's really important to think about the difference between guilt and responsibility, right? And I think that part of what history is understanding the shoulders on which we're standing, right? We're not necessarily guilty of the sins of our forebears, right? But we are absolutely responsible for what happens from here on out, right? So that's one thing that I like to tell my students. And part about history is that it's exposing kind of the messiness of everything. Right? And these are very messy processes, and they don't happen overnight, and they're very complicated, but we absolutely have to be honest with ourselves and with each other. And going into that vision of understanding history, not necessarily as ascribing guilt. I mean, there's guilty people, and we should probably say so. But it's about being honest with it so that we can actually fix the stuff that needs to be fixed.
No, I think, Adam, you begin by acknowledging the brokenness of the human condition, very simply, and by acknowledging that life is always yin-yang. We know as individuals, as members of families, as members of communities, it's darkness and light. It's good and bad. It's this whole welter of things that are all part of being human. So I think for history to pretend to be anything other than that would be false. So that our job is to kind of tell the story, to cover the waterfront.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. It's important that we be honest. And one of the things that I try to explore in terms of African American experiences, we hear all the horrific, experiences and things of that nature. But I try to look for the resilience that we've shown, over 400 years in this country. We are a very, very resilient community. And to find those ways that we showed that resilience in the face of, horrific crimes against us and things of that nature. Those are the stories that we don't hear enough. We're not victims of America. We're people who lived in America, and certain things happened to us, but we fought back against those things consistently, continually, and that's left out of our history way too much. I think is that resilience and how we reacted to things. A lot of things that we as Americans take for granted in terms of the rights that we have those rights because African Americans fought for us to have those rights. And we don't necessarily get credit for those things. But I always say that when we think about the civil rights movement wasn't for Black people. It was for all Americans. It was to create rights to protect everyone. And those are parts of the thread of history. I think that's really important, is to look at how people dealt with bad things and not necessarily ascribing guilt, but being honest. And I think some people, it's very hard when you've been taught one version of American history and you learn things that make that kind of a messy look for you, where it doesn't fit with the narrative that you learn. But we have to accept that. And I think that we're doing a much better job of that now in this day and time than we ever have before, in terms of looking at a variety of different perspectives on this history. And I think, to me, the thing that's been most valuable for me in terms of looking at it is learning the history of multiple different groups of people. So studying Native American history, studying the history of different white ethnic groups who've come to this country, studying the different Asian groups, the Japanese, the Chinese, Koreans, the Filipinos, studying Latino culture and all of the different manifestations of that. I think that that's what really helps me to kind of wrap my mind around the messiness of history, to understand that all of us are kind of in this box together, and we've all contributed in some way, shape, or form to what America is.
Yeah, I can't imagine a better place to stop than that, gentlemen. Thank you for your time today. We certainly appreciate you. Joe, Reggie, John, I can't imagine a better trio to have the conversation today about how we got to the open housing marches and how our city got sorted in the way it has. We thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you guys.
We really appreciate it. For the folks who were in attendance, we will do another one of these next Wednesday. Next Wednesday's conversation, we will have Erica Metcalf and Patrick Jones talking about their specific research on the open housing marches. So we'll have another scholar roundtable, and we'll dig more specifically into what those works and their historical contributions have informed us along these topics. Adam, you got anything else before we go?
Michelle was just pointing out in the chat a little bit about how to hold some of these conversations in the present day around public education and other spaces, and mentions groups like Power to the Parents, MICA, LIT, a Black Educators Caucus, and our last week, so the week after next week, is going to be a conversation we have with contemporary activists. So we're arcing that way.
We sure are. All righty, folks. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for the panelists. You all have a wonderful day. I'm going to end the live stream at this moment, and then we'll hang on here for just a couple minutes just to wrap up otherwise. Take care, folks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we are no longer live streaming, but we are still in the Zoom. We've got a few folks who are still with us. In fact, we've got 28 people who are still with us. And,
that was really wonderful.
What to do with them right now?
No, I mean, I will say that was really wonderful. I feel like I have a whole set of range of experiences with Zoom calls, and I felt very comfortable and happy just to be present.
We're just lurking.
No, yeah, man.
You can lurk. And if any other questions come up, folks, drop them in the chat. Reggie, Joe, John, if you got to jump off, please do. But, you know, we're going to hang out for a little bit just as long as we can.
Okay.
You all are very welcome. Thank you for
Great.
Thanks for the invitation. It was fun to be here.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah. And
Good to
Reggie,
see you,
yeah, thank
John,
you very
Joe.
much.
There's something I like to add. You know, I've done work with several different local school districts in Metro Milwaukee, and there are efforts to begin to create a more kind of inclusive history in the school districts. You know, a lot of new curriculum is being written and developed by different school districts, particularly the suburban school districts, to kind of begin to include the history of people of color. And I think that's wonderful that that's happening. It's well needed. And, you know, the effort on the part of those educators to jump into that, for those administrators in those districts to even explore the idea of being more inclusive, I think is a really positive sign of kind of where we become, where we're going moving forward. It's beautiful to see.
Yeah, I mean, yep. Rob and I, in doing this, we find it's easier to get invited to suburban schools than ones in the city, which is kind of frustrating, but we're working on that too.
Right.
You know, of course, we put up the restrictive covenants of Tulsa and all the other districts.
I mean, that's really, that I feel is really important. Like when we presented to Tulsa East for their Black History program, and we put, this is the restrictive covenant that applied to the neighborhood that we're sitting in right now.
Right.
And I think that's, you know, that's real.
Yeah.
You got Nate Rice still out there. What's going on, Nate Rice? How you doing? You got Nate Rice is over at West Dallas Central, and he's been doing some work with the young African American men over there, and went out and did a talk with those folks. How's it going, Nate? Just see if I recognize any other names of folks who are still with us.
Adriana pointed out there was once an effort to insert Milwaukee history and curriculum by Milwaukee Grassroots Curriculum Task Force. Man, that is, so Joe, you mentioned this. Sometimes I think about the holes in the archive. There's been so much grassroots work in the city where, you know, I'll be talking to Venus Williams and she'll tell me something that isn't documented anywhere, but the heart and minds of the people who are involved in it. And there's so many holes in the archives in terms of grassroots work that wasn't institutional, wasn't organizational, maybe didn't need press, but, you know, oftentimes are the change agents.
Yeah, Claiborne clicked some of that. Claiborne Benson, you know, he has some things out there on Center Street. I'm not sure how current that is. You know, Reggie? They're keeping.
Yeah. You know, Claiborne has a treasure trove of you know, information, anecdotal stories, interviews. You know, I think, you know, one of the points that you made earlier, John, about all the thousands of people you've interviewed, I think it's really important for us as historians to think about where we are right now and understand that a lot of those stories are being lost due to COVID-19. We're losing those elders that have those stories, and we have to figure out some way of getting those stories, you know, from people before it's too late. I mean, I'm really very concerned that we're going to lose a big piece of the city's history because we're losing these elders in such large numbers. It's
well,
really,
you know, and what we have to do, and there are a couple of efforts afoot to begin documenting the moment. Also documenting April 7th itself was its own moment in American history, the election. But Zoom and everything else is built for oral histories. You know, if we can get folks on Zoom, if we can get folks on some of these digital platforms, we can do an interview, and, you know, we can get a video if folks are comfortable with that too. So we do have a moment that you're absolutely right. We're losing some people. We're at home anyway, you know, and we can get some folks online and share some of those stories now.
Yeah, StoryCorps was doing that until a couple of years ago. They had that booth down there at the Central Library. That was good stuff. No one's had any kind of concerted institutional effort to carry that forward. You're absolutely
right. To that point, Samuel Woods and Adriana Sam says, I'm not sure if you're still, he's a journalist. What are some things happening now that you feel will be lost to history if they are not documented? It's sort of moving along more with more detail with Adam's thought. And then Adriana says here, Literacy Services of Wisconsin works with adults of all ages. Would love to empower our older students to contribute oral histories. Adriana, can you drop your email? I'll give you my email. Let's be in touch about that.
I mean, one of the things, I work with Sam, so he can hear me later, but one of the things I think to connect with the points you guys were just talking about is the history and the story of Bronzeville. That is the generation that is passing now. And I think, so I was just down in Memphis, and like the fact that Walnut Street is gone is incalculably damaging to the archive and the shared memory of the historic Black neighborhoods in Milwaukee. So I think in some ways, like, that to me is one of the places that we've lost a lot of already. And Mark Doremus just made a PBS documentary, and there's other work that's been done, but Reuben Harpole got coronavirus too, so we're just kind of in a moment where the people who really are the torchbearers of that story are at the greatest risk of being lost. And that to me, there's sort of an urgency to that.
For the folks who are still with us, I just went ahead and gave you all access. So you can unmute if you like and join our conversation. Either that or we're going to call on you.
Raise your virtual hand.
So jump in the conversation. And again, Reggie, Joe, John, when you guys need to go, please don't hesitate to get out of here. We're just continuing to let the kindling work.
I would add to the things that are happening now that might be lost to history if we don't document it now. I'd like to drop a shout out to my colleague Rachel Buff, my advisor, dissertation advisor. Rachel Buff and her students have worked really hard to document deportation cases that have been going on, particularly in the current political environment. And they're working very hard to do that. And I think that if those are things that are typically silenced. There isn't much documentation about that unless they're captured in this moment. And to that end, I think the work that people are doing now to kind of push back against mass incarceration, mass deportation, things that are not, as we've said, like institutionalized in other ways, that are just like kind of grassroots organizations that are more memory based, I guess, and then on paper, that might not actually get a place in an archive. Like if we can some of those, that'd be really amazing.
Yeah, one concern I have is the decline of the mainstream media. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel is now the same size as the Anago Daily Herald, and that would have been unthinkable, even 10 years ago. The reasons are not hard to understand. As people have moved online, the advertising lineage shrinks, so they can't support the paper. But when I think of all of us, how many miles of microfilm we scrolled through, to get the stories that we tell, that's going to be an impoverished resource for the next generation of historians. And the ephemeral nature, a lot of the online services, who's cataloging that? Who's paying attention to kind of who's out there, whether it's or the news platforms or the bloggers, kind of who's keeping track of that? Who'll be able to access that a generation from now? That's a concern. That's a concern.
Kristen, can you do that for us? Kristen Leffelman? Sorry, that was a joke.
For anyone who would like to answer this, my name's Keisha. Like Rob said earlier, I just finished up my MA at Marquette, and one of the things that I study, those are my kids in the background, so
that's fine. That's fine.
Thank you to parents, this is real life. But one of the things that I study is material culture, and with that, objects, but also things such as fashion and what people are buying, why they're buying it. So within your studies, especially when thinking about homes and the way people manifest their identities through their material culture, is there anything that you've encountered or study or would like to study to understand the experience of race through material items, or the way someone is projecting or trying to overcome obstacles even through the material items in their world?
One of the things that comes to my mind thinking of that, Keisha, is the idea of looking at the old photographs of Bronzeville, and how people dressed. They wore their Sunday best even when it wasn't Sunday, and how people wanted to present themselves. And looking at like images of many of the organizations that existed, the women's clubs and variety of things like that, to kind of see how people showed who they were in different spaces, and looking at the clothing that they wore, looking at things that they purchased. People who were poor, I've always said this about poor people. Poor people don't want you to know they're poor, so they go out of their way to not look poor. And people often criticize poor people for buying things that, you can't afford to buy that, but they're really doing it in a way to kind of present a specific image, because we're very judgmental as a society. And so when you look at those old images, I think back to, old images that I've seen from around the country where every man wore a hat. I just can't imagine what that was like to have been a man who, I can't afford to buy a hat. Well, you would have stood out like a sore thumb. And so just kind of looking at how Americans overall have presented themselves in different eras is really, really very interesting to see what things like clothing did for people in terms of how they presented themselves to the public.
So Reggie, you know why some people think the hat died?
Why is that?
The automobile.
Oh,
Getting into a car, you couldn't wear a hat. Until then, every guy in America wore a hat. This is not that many years ago. I bet they're still there. There's a church on the south side around 8th and Scott called St. Peter's Lutheran. It's a Wisconsin Synod church.
mm-hmm.
And their custom was that the women sat on the left side facing the altar, and the men sat on the right side facing the altar. I was in there with the pastor a while back, I was interviewing him. And he said, "What do you notice on the right side that's not on the left side?" And what it was, on the back of each pew were these spring-loaded hat holders. And every pew on the men's side had them, and there were none of them on the women's side. You talk about material culture.
Right.
Right there.
Hi,
There's
everyone.
a graduate student at Marquette who just finished his dissertation, Peter Borg. I think Peter might have joined us today. And he did a really interesting dissertation on the churches there in and around North Ave and MLK, which would be obviously in the Bronzeville area, that were obviously predominantly white churches as African Americans are migrating to the city in large numbers, and the decisions that the churches are making about whether to stay or move to different parts of the city. And one moves to Tulsa, one moves northwest in some ways, largely west, but still stays in Milwaukee, and then one stays there. And so there's a rich history in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s about how those churches are negotiating the changing environment. And for some reason, Keisha, your thought about material culture made me think of that research. And I just wonder to what extent the archival reservoirs that are churches mean to us, and whether it's worth mining some more of those basements and attics and cellars for documents that folks just might have sitting around who haven't really thought much about them in a long time.
Well, I can tell you, with the Catholic Church, a good friend of mine, Mike Previte, has gotten to be a good friend of mine over the last couple of years, and he introduced me to the archives at the Catholic Church. The Archdiocese has tremendous records on the history of all those Catholic churches, and so that's the place that I spent some time looking through old records, and it's very interesting to see the progression of how those churches changed over the course of time, and it's a treasure trove of information that you can't find anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
The Archdiocese, the wonderful folks over there, the archivists there, the librarians there. It's kind of a hidden spot that people don't know about, and you can't necessarily gain access to it very easily.
A little foreshadowing, we should talk about that with Patrick Jones next week, because I know he spent some time in the Catholic Archive, and I guess we'll let him represent what his experience was there. That's something to talk about next week.
This might be a stretch, and hello everybody, but I just wanted to address material culture. This was something that I studied as well, but this could be a stretch, but connected to the churches, especially the church basement sales and thrift stores, especially for for, I will say, like immigrant communities, these are this is a new concept for people coming from other countries that, you know, run their goods into the ground. There's no such thing as, you know, giving it up before, you know, it's no good. So I think, you know, growing up in Milwaukee, myself and my family were Mexican. So that was natural to go to thrift stores. And, you know, speaking for some students that I work with adults, adult students, and a lot of our English language learners, they're just like astounded that they can get everything that they do at thrift stores in Milwaukee. So like I said, it might be a stretch, but I think it is really interesting, especially when you're talking about material culture and the meaningfulness behind it for different ethnic groups or communities in Milwaukee. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Around the South Side, I think if Milwaukee, its flag should be, there's so many yard sales on the South Side, it should be the set of hung shirts hanging from a banister or from a rail, because that's all like, so not only are there thrift stores, people are making their own front yards, thrift stores too.
Right. And
You want
there's
to design
I'm sorry, it's reflected in language also in Hispanic or Latinos here in Milwaukee. We have words like rumaje, it's a rummage, but just a Spanish pronunciation of it. Segundas, they're the secondhand stores. So this has also entered the language of Latinos, and I'm sure all over the country. But yeah, I grew up thinking that rumaje was a real Spanish word until I learned it wasn't.
That's really interesting. That's good stuff. Folks, those who are still with us, you can unmute if you want to join our conversation. I've tried to give you, I've given you panelist access, and I'm going to actually make you a co-host, and then you can just run the next one for us too. Join us.
So Adam, you want to design a new flag? We did that.
He said, "No, come on, Michelle."
I'm from Milwaukee. I don't care about what anyone else does.
All right, let's wrap it up. Let's get these guys out of here. Let's
Okay.
call it. All right, thank you, folks. I'm going to end this thing. I appreciate your time. This was riveting. History is fun. I don't care what anybody says.